Across the Sahel today, something has quietly but profoundly changed. If you look at a map of the region and mark the cities that were once considered relatively secure, you will notice a troubling pattern. Places like Niamey, Bamako, and even strategic military outposts in northern Mali are no longer insulated from attack. They are no longer protected by distance, desert, or the assumption that armed groups lack sophisticated tools. Instead, they can now be reached from above by devices that cost less than a family car and can be carried in a backpack. In recent months, attacks involving small drones have targeted military bases, fuel convoys, and even infrastructure near international airports. Armed groups linked to ISIL and al-Qaeda have increasingly integrated commercial drones and first-person view systems into their operations. At the same time, leaders of the Alliance of Sahel States, known as AES, have issued repeated warnings. They argue that the growing instability in the region is not simply organic. They accuse Ukraine of providing technical assistance, training, and intelligence to certain armed actors, particularly in the use of drones. Mali and Niger have gone as far as cutting diplomatic ties, framing the situation as part of a broader pattern of external interference. This raises a deeper and more uncomfortable question. Are we witnessing a localized insurgency that has merely adapted to new tools? Or are we seeing the opening chapter of a new kind of proxy and technology-driven conflict in Africa? Drones equipped with improvised explosives, supported by artificial intelligence tools that assist with surveillance and coordination, are changing the tactical balance. The critical issue is not only who is supplying this technology, but how easily it can be acquired, learned, and deployed. Tonight, we will examine where these drones and digital tools may be coming from, why their use is accelerating, how AES leaders interpret this shift, and whether new technology is making the fight against ISIL and al-Qaeda in the Sahel significantly harder than before. For decades, the battlefield across the Sahel followed a grim but familiar script. Armed groups moved through rural terrain on motorcycles or pickup trucks. They relied on assault rifles, roadside improvised explosive devices, and sudden ambushes on poorly supplied military convoys. Governments responded with ground patrols, checkpoints, and occasional air support. The balance was uneven, but it was at least recognizable. Territory changed hands slowly, and major cities were often shielded by distance and by the logistical limits of insurgent groups. That script has been rewritten. Since 2023, analysts have documented a sharp rise in the use of small commercial drones by groups linked to al-Qaeda and ISIL. Jamaat Nusrat al-Islam wal-Muslimin, often referred to as JNIM, has used drones dozens of times in operations across Mali and Burkina Faso. The Azawad Liberation Front has released footage showing first-person view drones striking military targets in northern Mali. In Nigeria, ISIL's West Africa province has deployed armed drones in attacks on security forces. These are not isolated experiments. They represent a pattern of adaptation. The financial barrier to entry is surprisingly low. A consumer drone can cost between $500 and $700. With modest technical modification, it can carry a small explosive device or be used to guide mortar fire with far greater precision than before. Instead of exposing fighters to direct confrontation, groups can observe, adjust, and strike from a relative distance. This reduces their casualties while increasing psychological pressure on government troops. Perhaps most concerning is the expansion of targets. Attacks are no longer confined to remote rural outposts. Fuel convoys, military hangars, and infrastructure near major cities have come under threat. Even when damage is limited, the symbolic impact is powerful. A single drone reaching a capital city sends a message that no place is entirely beyond reach. For governments in the Sahel, the shift complicates an already fragile security environment. What once required large formations and visible movement can now be attempted with a handful of operators, a laptop, and a drone carried in a backpack. If we step back and ask a simple question, the next layer of this story becomes even more complex. Where exactly are these drones coming from? Are they the product of a hidden state pipeline? Or are they the inevitable outcome of a global marketplace where advanced technology is widely available to anyone with money and basic technical skill? Most of the drones documented in Sahel attacks are not military-grade aircraft produced in secret factories. They are commercial models originally designed for photography, mapping, or industrial inspection. Popular systems such as the DJI Mavic series or more advanced platforms like the DJI M30T are widely sold across international markets. A mid-range drone can cost between $500 and $700. Higher-end surveillance models cost more, but they remain within reach for organized networks with access to smuggling routes and external funding. The Sahel is already crisscrossed by trafficking corridors that move fuel, weapons, migrants, and consumer goods. Small drones and spare parts are far easier to conceal than heavy weapons. They can be transported in pieces and assembled locally. In that sense, globalization itself lowers the barrier to entry. A device manufactured in Asia, purchased in Europe or the Middle East, and transported through North Africa can end up over a military camp in Mali within weeks. This reality complicates the accusation that any single country exclusively controls the flow of drone technology into the region. Even if external actors provide training or advice, the hardware itself is commercially accessible. Knowledge spreads rapidly through online videos, encrypted messaging groups, and battlefield observation. Fighters study footage from conflicts in Eastern Europe or the Middle East and adapt techniques to desert terrain. So, the uncomfortable truth is this: modern conflict no longer requires a superpower sponsor to access basic aerial capability. The market has democratized the tools of surveillance and precision strike. That does not eliminate the possibility of state involvement, but it means that technology itself has become borderless, difficult to regulate, and nearly impossible to contain once it reaches a conflict zone. The accusations directed at Ukraine by leaders of the Alliance of Sahel states add a sharply political dimension to this technological shift. Mali and Niger have formally severed diplomatic relations with Kyiv, arguing that Ukraine has provided technical support, intelligence sharing, and even training linked to armed actors operating in northern Mali. Officials from these governments have raised the issue at the United Nations, framing the matter as part of a broader pattern of external interference in African security affairs. According to statements from authorities in Bamako, Malian forces reportedly seized documents and drone equipment bearing Ukrainian markings during counterterrorism operations. Additional claims suggest that some fighters associated with separatist networks may have received training abroad. From the perspective of AES leaders, these elements form a coherent narrative. They argue that the rapid professionalization of drone tactics in the region cannot be explained by local improvisation alone. In their view, the timing of increased drone usage coincides with shifting geopolitical alignments in the Sahel, particularly as military governments distanced themselves from Western partners and sought alternative security arrangements. However, it is important to recognize that these claims remain politically contested. Independent international investigations confirming direct Ukrainian state involvement have not been publicly established. Kyiv has denied supporting terrorist organizations, while acknowledging that it has engaged with actors opposed to Russian-affiliated forces present in Mali. This distinction matters. In a complex battlefield environment, lines between insurgents, separatists, and counter-Russian militias can blur, creating space for competing interpretations. For observers, the key question is whether the alleged support represents a structured state policy or limited contacts shaped by broader geopolitical rivalry. The accusations have strengthened domestic cohesion within AES states by reinforcing a narrative of sovereignty under threat. Yet they also risk further fragmenting international diplomacy. Ultimately, whether Ukraine is a central actor or a peripheral one, the controversy illustrates how drone warfare in the Sahel is no longer only about tactics. It has become embedded in a larger contest over influence, alliances, and the future direction of the region. While drones have transformed the physical battlefield, artificial intelligence is quietly reshaping the invisible one. Armed groups in the Sahel are no longer relying solely on manual piloting skills or improvised tactics. Analysts have warned that offline artificial intelligence tools are beginning to support drone operations in ways that make detection and disruption more difficult for conventional militaries. Unlike large military systems that depend on satellite networks and complex infrastructure, many of these artificial intelligence tools can function without a constant internet connection. That matters in remote regions where connectivity is limited, but innovation spreads through portable storage devices and encrypted messaging platforms. Artificial intelligence can assist with route planning, terrain analysis, and even basic object recognition, helping operators identify vehicles, defensive positions, or patterns of movement before launching an attack. The integration of drone footage and artificial intelligence-driven analysis allows armed groups to gather intelligence in real time, instead of sending scouts into dangerous territory. Operators can observe from a distance, record patterns, and strike when vulnerabilities appear, even when the explosive payload carried by a small drone is limited. The intelligence value can be significant. Fuel trucks attempting to bypass blockades, military convoys shifting routes, or temporary bases can all be monitored discreetly. Another concern is the potential evolution toward coordinated drone operations. Analysts have described scenarios in which multiple drones operate simultaneously, overwhelming defensive systems through numbers rather than size. This concept, often referred to as a swarm approach, could allow small groups to project disproportionate force against fixed targets. Artificial intelligence is also used beyond direct combat. It can assist in producing training materials, editing propaganda footage, and generating messaging designed to recruit or intimidate. In this sense, technology accelerates learning cycles. Groups do not simply acquire tools, they adapt, refine, and distribute knowledge faster than ever before. For governments in the Sahel, this combination of affordable hardware and accessible software represents a dual challenge. The battlefield is no longer defined only by territory. It is increasingly defined by information, data, and the speed at which both can be processed. Western governments and many international analysts have pushed back firmly against the accusations made by leaders of the Alliance of Sahel States. Their central argument is straightforward. The proliferation of commercial drones in conflict zones is a global trend, not a phenomenon unique to the Sahel and not necessarily directed by any single state. From Eastern Europe to the Middle East, non-state armed groups have demonstrated how quickly inexpensive aerial platforms can be weaponized. Officials and observers in Europe and North America often argue that the rise in drone attacks reflects structural weaknesses within Sahelian security institutions, rather than a coordinated foreign campaign. They point to long-standing governance challenges, porous borders, and limited air defense capabilities. In this view, technology is amplifying existing vulnerabilities rather than creating them from scratch. Some critics also suggest that military governments may highlight external interference to consolidate domestic legitimacy and shift attention away from unmet security expectations. However, from the perspective of AES leaders, these counterarguments can appear dismissive. They contend that timing matters. The escalation of drone sophistication has occurred alongside major geopolitical realignments. including the expulsion of Western troops and the arrival of new security partnerships. In their analysis, it would be naive to assume that global rivalries stop at the edge of the Sahara. Even if commercial drones are widely available, training, intelligence coordination, and operational guidance can still be influenced by external actors. There is also a broader historical context. African states have long experienced proxy competition between larger powers. When advanced tools suddenly appear in the hands of insurgent groups, suspicion follows naturally. Whether those suspicions are fully substantiated or not, they shape policy decisions and diplomatic relations. The debate, therefore, is not simply about hardware. It is about trust, sovereignty, and competing narratives. Western governments emphasize structural reform and regional cooperation. AES governments emphasize external interference and the right to defend their autonomy. Between these positions lies a complex reality in which technology, politics, and perception intersect, making clear answers difficult and mutual confidence even harder to rebuild. Beyond the political debate and the technical analysis lies a harder strategic reality for the governments of Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso. The spread of drones and artificial intelligence tools is steadily eroding what little asymmetric advantage state forces once possessed. Traditionally, even poorly equipped armies could rely on one critical strength. They controlled the skies. Insurgent groups might dominate remote terrain, but they rarely threatened airfields, urban centers, or heavily guarded installations. That assumption is no longer safe. When a small drone can cross several kilometers undetected and drop an improvised explosive device onto a fuel depot or military hangar, the psychological balance shifts. Soldiers begin to feel watched at all times. Supply lines require new layers of protection. Even when physical damage is limited, the perception of vulnerability can spread faster than the explosion itself. This transformation forces governments to rethink resource allocation. Instead of concentrating forces in contested rural zones, authorities must now invest in low-altitude air surveillance, electronic countermeasures, and rapid response teams capable of neutralizing small aerial threats. These systems are expensive and require training, maintenance, and coordination. For countries already under financial strain, diverting funds to counter drone capabilities places additional pressure on budgets stretched by humanitarian crises and economic challenges. There is also the regional dimension. Armed groups do not respect borders. If one country strengthens its defenses while its neighbor remains exposed, operators can simply shift launch points across porous frontiers. Fragmented political relations in West Africa complicate joint strategies. Although the Alliance of Sahel States has announced plans for closer security coordination, effective integration takes time and trust. Looking ahead, the risk is not only incremental improvement in drone tactics, it is acceleration. As technology evolves, so do methods. If multiple drones are launched simultaneously, defensive systems may be overwhelmed. If artificial intelligence enhances navigation and targeting, detection windows shrink further. For the Sahel, the question is no longer whether drones change the battlefield. They already have. The question is whether governments can adapt faster than the groups they are trying to defeat. When we step back and look at the full picture, a clear pattern begins to emerge. The Sahel is not simply facing a wave of isolated drone attacks. It is confronting a structural shift in how power is projected, how influence is exercised, and how conflicts are sustained. Cheap aerial technology, combined with accessible artificial intelligence tools, has lowered the barrier to entry for groups that once relied only on mobility and surprise. Today, they can observe, adapt, and strike with a level of coordination that was once reserved for formal militaries. Three possible futures now stand before the region. The first scenario is adaptation. Governments in Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso invest heavily in counter-drone systems, strengthen intelligence sharing, and deepen operational coordination within the alliance of Sahel states. They develop layered defenses that combine radar, electronic disruption, and rapid response units. Over time, the tactical advantage of armed groups narrows, and drone attacks become less effective. Stability does not arrive overnight, but the balance begins to stabilize. The second scenario is escalation. Armed groups refine swarm tactics, improve artificial intelligence-assisted navigation, and expand operations toward economic infrastructure and major urban centers. In this path, each technological advance forces governments into reactive spending, stretching limited resources even further. Public confidence erodes as symbolic attacks multiply. The third scenario is geopolitical entanglement. Accusations of foreign support intensify, diplomatic rifts widen, and the Sahel becomes more deeply embedded in global rivalries. Whether Ukraine plays a central role or a marginal one, the perception of external interference could harden positions and complicate cooperation with international partners. If there is one lesson to carry forward, it is this: technology itself is not neutral in a fragile environment. When advanced tools become affordable and portable, they reshape the rules of engagement. The real question is not only who supplied the first drone or wrote the first line of code. The deeper question is who will adapt fastest to a battlefield where the sky is no longer secure. I am here to help you decode power, not just follow headlines. If you have a different perspective, share it. The future of the Sahel will not be decided by technology alone, but by how leaders, soldiers, and citizens respond to it.